Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me. This will be a talk of cliffhangers, so this is kind of part one of many, many parts that could be presented. Because the topic is so vast that what I'm going to tell you today just is a little part of it. One of the first conversations we had with the Grandmaster Kalle was about a man called Jacob Gustav Pontusson de la Gardie. I will not talk so much about him today, so that's also one of the cliffhangers, but he's a really interesting person in the history of diplomacy and Freemasonry in Europe. Because he was a Swede who presided the union between the ancients and the moderns in 1813 in England. And the De la Gardie family has connections to Estonia, but also to other parts around the Baltic Sea. De la Gardie was a part of what you could call the Swedish government for a long time. He was also an ambassador in Spain, and he was very much involved in Freemasonry. He was also a very instrumental person to bring about public schools in Sweden, even before we established public schools in Sweden in 1842, and established banks, insurances, donated money to the University of Lund in southern Sweden, Skåne, where I took my PhD. A remarkable character that is part of the early history of Swedish Freemasonry. So, when I was asked to present today, I said I will have to start with some kind of more general picture. And then I will, at another occasion, hopefully be able to tell you more about the remarkable life of Freemason diplomat Johan Jacob Gustav Pontusson de la Gardie. What I'm going to talk about today? Well, first I will talk a little bit about the organization culture of Freemasonry, because sometimes it seems as a topic that is not so exciting, but I think it is, because it points to the future. Jim Damos was already talking about the legacy of the 1723 constitutions, and why are the constitutions important? Not only because they have a very nice song in the end, but they are kind of preparing Freemasons to go out in the world and build lodges in different continents. And that happens both on the very local level and on the international level, where diplomacy and Freemasonry kind of overlap. Then I will talk about the peculiar case of Swedish-Anglo relations around 1800. They kind of set the stage for De la Gardie being the person who merges the ancients and the moderns Grand Lodge, and the overlap between diplomacy and Freemasonry in that specific case, to put that into context. And then I will dare to make some kind of lessons for the future's reflections at the end of my presentation. We have already heard that there are connections that are going from New York to Tallinn, because the Grand Lodge of New York established the Finnish Grand Lodge, and the Finnish Grand Lodge established the province of Estonia, and then later on was instrumental in bringing about the recognition of the Grand Lodge of Estonia. The seal that you can see in the background is of a lodge in New York that I have been researching, called no, it's not. It's sorry, because this one is from a petition to a lodge in New York that was called the Union Lodge, and this was a lodge where French emigres after the Napoleonic Wars and Germans worked together in New York. And it's a very interesting topic, and I've been writing about German immigrant lodges to New York as well. And I think the fascinating thing with the international history of Freemasonry are all these dimensions where people are moving across the globe and are bringing their Freemasonry with them. They're coming to new local conditions, they're writing back to their Grand Lodges. Sometimes harmony, sometimes it's not, as you know. But in the end, Freemasonry prevails, and that's so fascinating and interesting. So, in 2017, I published a book on Oxford University Press called Freemasonry, A Very Short Introduction. And I will start off to say something about that I wrote in this book when it comes to the organization culture of Freemasonry. yeah, we can start here. In the chapter I wrote about organizational culture, I talk about Masonic self-jurisdiction or self-governance. These are terms that you that come from political theory, basically. But I mean, I cannot help. I'm an academic. I'm trying to project things in my understanding of Freemasonry as well. I think that's a very important term to have in mind. That is that what is going on since 1723 is that Freemasonry voluntarily agrees upon certain rules, and that these rules are kind of followed or not followed over across the globe. And it manifests itself through patents, certificates, constitutions, and warrants. And maybe the most important thing that has happened is the development of the idea of authority, the territorial idea of authority or jurisdiction. It's a very complex and conflicting concept, but it is there, and was certainly an innovation of Freemasonry to come up with that. Normally, Freemasons across the globe voluntarily submit to these rules, but there are also divergences on own discretion. There's a flexible adaptation to a host of local contexts across the globe. But in the end, and as we heard from the Scottish presentation, what we should understand is the smallest organizational unit in Freemasonry is the lodge. That is, I think, one of the most important messages when we think about the self-organization of Freemasonry is that we have the lodge as the most fundamental unit, and that we have a tension between bottom-up and top-down understandings of Freemasonry. So, is Freemasonry actually is Freemasonry an organization that is made of bottom-up organizations, or is it a top-down understanding? A Grand Lodge establishes certain lodges and they make out a Grand Lodge. And then we have the tensions or the differences between regional and national levels, as we already have been talking about. We have provincial Grand Lodges and national Grand Lodges. But what is interesting is that the international relations are rather unregulated, because we heard before about the rules of Grand Lodge recognition. But when did it all start? When did the international relations in Freemasonry actually start? And it's really an interesting question, because who came up with the idea to establish a Grand Lodge in France or in Sweden or in Italy, and how would it all be regulated? That was not as particularly clear until the 1760s, and I will come back to an incident that surrounds this episode in a while. I think it simply does. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And to continue further on these concepts of Masonic regularity or irregularity and recognition, Jim was talking about it before, we have the major schism on the issue of freedom of conscience before and during the 1870s. Normally we talk about the Grand Orient Freemasonry and France and Belgium being at the heart of this conflict, but in reality it was built up since at least 5 decades before that. You can see that this tension between what Freemasonry means in society and for society already starts in the decades after the French Revolution. And this is the culmination of something that comes in 1877. And then we have these already discussed 8 important principles of Grand Lodge recognition from the Sign of the UGLE, and I think the Irish and Scottish Grand Lodges also subscribe to or were instrumental in bringing those about. But in practical terms, one could say that the main issue with the Grand Lodge recognition is the intervisitation right on the individual level. So the individual member is precluded from visiting a lodge that is not recognized. And then we have the principle of territorial sovereignty, one Grand Lodge in one country. We know that this is a rule that is more or less also debatable and has very many exceptions. We have national Grand Lodges in Germany before 1935 that were organized across Germany, or we have the Prince Hall Grand Lodges in the US, where you have a second Grand Lodge in different states, and so on. But then we have, of course, many fake organizations that claim that they are Freemasons or not. And they're neither regular nor recognized. Why I'm starting at this end is, you can switch to the next slide, please, is that in the end what it boils down to is that Freemasonry since 1723 became a school for government, as Margaret C. Jacob has called it. So Masonic Lodges prepared their members and practiced important governmental functions, and more specifically democratic functions, according to Margaret Jacob. That is the Union Lodge seal I wanted to show, or thought I was showing you at the beginning, but this is the Union Lodge in New York I was talking about in the beginning, where German and French Freemasons worked together at the beginning of the 1800s in New York. What I think is the fascinating thing with Freemasonry is that there's this culture of self-government that prepares for an active citizenship. So that answers some of the questions, why are we doing this actually? Why is it important? Why does Freemasonry work in systems that are democratic or more open societies? And why are more autocratic societies not inclined to support Freemasonry? And that is because of that some people come together, they form a lodge, they have their freedoms, they think that they're acting in accordance to internationally agreed, voluntarily agreed norms, and that self-governance is the preparation for an active citizenship. And you can see it happening in every lodge, on a local and a global level, in voting, in collecting fees, in correspondence, and issuing passports to the members, and civil society activity, like charity project and society, like we heard of before in Scotland. It's also important to have in mind that many Masonic lodges, provincial lodges and grand lodges, were the first non-governmental organizations in large parts of the world. So today we are talking about non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations as a typical part of open societies. But if you go back in history, that starts in the 18th century, and that is why it's fascinating. Because they are the first who do this, who come up with rules and organize themselves. And INGO, if you don't know what that means, is an international non-governmental organization. As we all know, Freemasonry is not an international organization, but on one level it is, because it is practiced everywhere, also even in different forms. But that makes it so interesting. Sometimes Freemasonry also substitutes for the absence of formal structures, which is something that I've learned in the United States. So it is not only the case that many Masonic Grand Lodges were established before the sovereignty of a sovereignty of a state, but it is also true that Freemasonry sometimes has substituted for the absence of formal governing structures. And that happened, for instance, in the Great American West when the Masonic lodges came there, before there was any statehood, neither on the local or regional or national level, which is super fascinating. We have a successful pattern of organization across the globe since and before 1723. And we have millions of members that have become initiated. So, let's continue. But with that background in mind, to set the kind of theoretical stage for that, I want to bring you into one particular episode of Masonic diplomacy that played out between Sweden and England around 1800, and why I think it's fascinating. Documents like the one you can see here are very prominent in Masonic archives across the globe. And sometimes you need to work hard to unpack what this really is about. This is a letter that was sent by the Prince of Wales, who was the then Grand Master of the Modest Grand Lodge, to Duke Charles, later King Charles XIII of Sweden, on the 8th of May 1788. Go to the next slide. And this is Duke Charles of Sudermania. As I said, he became Charles XIII, King of Sweden and King of Norway, and was Grand Master of Swedish Order of Freemasons between 1774 and 1818, so for a very long time. And here he is portrayed in his magnificent dress as a Grand Master of of the so-called ninth province of the order, as he believed that he was heading. Can go to the next slide. In this letter from the Prince of Wales, who was the Grand Master of the Moderns, to the Swedish Grand Master, that is a reply to a letter Duke Charles sent to him, in which he proposes a closer union between the two Grand Lodges. And then you can think of, yeah, well, and of course, it's nice because Grand Lodges also always want to work together. And then he says, the order in both countries is founded on the good of humanity. It is important to preserve that simplicity which has distinguished the order for so many centuries. It is vital to, quote, proscribe those novelties which furnish material for those dangerous enthusiasts or wicked conspirators working under the cover of darkness and under the sacred veil of our order. And we'll come back to that. Yeah, it's interesting. And then the letter finishes up with stating there are three principles: the adoration of the Almighty, the submission to the government of our native country, and the love for our neighbor. Very much so, things we recognize from Anderson's constitutions. And the letter finishes off with that Freemasonry enjoys royal protection in both Britain and Sweden. Okay, go to the next slide. That requires a little recap of the Swedish-Anglo relations during the 18th century until 1813. Because the first initiation of Sweden took place in 1735, then we got the French Constitution. 2 years later, we got a renewed French Constitution. The Grand Lodge of Sweden was established in 1760. In the 1760s, there was a conflict of interest with lodges that were established from England. That conflict was solved. There was basically no contact between Sweden and England until 1784, and then suddenly there was a renewed interest in the 1790s. And I just want to talk a little bit about this conflict of interest in the 1760s, because it's also an overlap between diplomacy and Freemasonry. There was this guy, Tullman, who worked at the British Embassy in Stockholm. And he said, your lodges in Sweden are not regular because you were not established by London. I'm establishing lodges in Sweden now, and we will establish a province of Sweden because that does not exist so far. So we established 2 lodges in Stockholm and 1 in Gothenburg, and 1 lodge of the high degrees. That later moved to Finland, but never mind. That, of course, was a complex situation because Sweden was in the absolute belief that their Grand Lodge was established with French patents and true with true patents, and was a regular Grand Lodge. But as I said before, the concept of Masonic diplomacy or international relations was kind of established in the 1760s. And the principles were developed by a man called de Vignol, whose name is written on the next point here. And this de Vignol was the first provincial Grand Master of foreign provinces, a title that he proposed himself to the modern Grand Master to regulate international affairs. And I can just say, somebody is there who wants to write a PhD thesis, all these de Vignol papers are very much so preserved and deserve much more research, because I think that a lot of the principles of international Masonic jurisdictions are already buried in these ideas that they had in the 1760s. The problem with the recognition of the Swedish Grand Lodge was solved in the early 1770s by our Grandmaster Schäfer, who wrote to London and explained to them how Sweden was established, so that was settled. But then the Swedish interest decreased until the end of the 1790s. And why? And that's because of geopolitics. Yeah, next slide, please. And I have to remind myself that I'm a university professor. I'm normally, talking for 90 minutes, and now I have to compress it to 45. So, okay. Oh, you can go to the next slide. This is just a picture of our first regulations we got in French. And this is that's the kind of correspondence I was talking about before. De Vignol writing from London to Stockholm in French, and sorting out this kind of Masonic diplomatic misunderstanding that had been happening between Sweden and London. And as I said, a super interesting person. De Vignol was also part of a very interesting lodge in London, L'Immortalité de l'Ordre, the immortality of the order, who had very many diplomats as its members, so it would also be very worthwhile to work on that particular lodge. And a very colorful person in the history of Masonic history, Chevalier d'Eon, maybe the first transgender person in Masonic history. I don't want to open that can, but he's a super interesting character, and that lodge was super interesting. L'Immortalité de l'Ordre, de Vignol belonged to. You can go to the next slide. What happened in the end of the 1790s? Well, as you all know, we had the French Revolution, and in the aftermath of the French Revolution, Freemasonry and the important or well-known and notorious Illuminati of Bavaria were accused to have orchestrated the French Revolution. And in Britain, legislation came up called the Unlawful Societies Act as a response to growing societal and political tensions. There was legislation passed to stem radical activism. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, there was an Irish rebellion. There were organizations like United Irishmen, Scotsmen, Englishmen, or the London Reading Society, all accused of kind of conspiring against the British government. And this legislation is clearly influenced by the growth of anti-Masonic conspiracy theories. There were two authors around, Baruel, who had written about the French Revolution, and a Scotsman, and Freemason actually, Robinson, who had written a book, Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All Governments in Europe. So the British government tried to control the kind of unlawful organizations that they saw were kind of using the pretext of being fraternal organizations, for instance, to in their political activism. And there's other legislation around in Europe that preceded that British legislation. I've written an entire article about that. But the interesting thing is here that the British government, in this Unlawful Societies Act, wants to regulate uncertainties that are related to voluntary association in the age of revolution and reaction. So that means we have revolutions going on in the continent, we have the, if you've seen the Napoleon movie, we have all the warfare that is going on, the coalition wars against Napoleon, and something has to be done. So in that moment, the British government says we have to control all kinds of voluntary associations, Freemasonry included, or not. And that was the issue when the legislation was passed. We can go to the next slide, please. So this is how the Unlawful Society Act looked. This is the Prussian pattern, which I think it was very much modeled on. So Prussia had also legislation here. In it, Freemasonry was exempted, but put under governmental control. And that is what happened in the end with the Unlawful Societies Act as well. So Freemasonry, for the first time, was part of the national legislation. First in Prussia, 1 year later in England, as a reaction upon the revolution. Next slide, please. So this anti-Masonry in Britain that we had in the 1790s, that you can read, for instance, these books of Baruel or Robinson. This is the title page of the Proofs of a Conspiracy. And he blames in particular continental forms of Freemasonry, higher degree of Freemasonry that is perverted and contributes to the excess of revolution, as he says in his book. British Freemasonry did something that was very modern, or English Freemasonry. They published a newspaper or a journal to boost the image of themselves in society. So in 1793, printers and what we today would call journalists, people in media in London came together to establish the Freemasons magazine in order to kind of control and influence the public opinion of Freemasonry and portray it in its most positive terms as a charitable society that's doing good for mankind and is intellectual and cultural. And this is a super interesting journal that came out then, and in it they attempted to counter growing anti-Masonry by referring to historical cases, when Freemasons had been prosecuted, and they argued openly against Robinson, and it displayed extreme loyalty and patriotism towards the English government. Okay, go to the next slide. But then comes in Swedish diplomacy, and this man, as you can see, was spelled in very different varieties. Was a Swedish diplomat who was in service in Britain for a long time. First as a secretary, then a chargé des affaires. He was a minister resident, envoyé extraordinaire, a minister plénipotentiaire. So all of kinds of functions you could wish that a person in diplomatic service would have. He was even married to a local in London, Harriet Matthew, and the Matthew family were patrons of art in London. But not only that, this man, Göran Silverhjelm, as we can call him, he was a part of the intimate circle of the Swedish Freemasonry and Duke Charles. And then around the time of this passing of the English legislation, Duke Charles contacts Silverhjelm while he is in Stockholm, and he goes back to London again and gives him a certain mission. You can take the next slide. So it is not only that Silverhjelm comes then back to Stockholm and gets his accreditation again to act as a minister in Britain in this precarious time when the coalition against Napoleon was formed, but he also got a secret mission as a Mason. And that is one part of it. He says Silverhjelm is obliged on all occasions to avoid the alleged supremacy or superiority with which English Freemasonry generally wants to exercise over the lodges of other countries, he says here. And since the Swedish Grand Lodge has never accepted the precedence from the English, such disputes are to be avoided diligently. But if such unexpectedly occur, the envoy of the Swedish Grand Lodge should clearly declare that since it owns its power and authority from a completely different place from England, it can also not accept the precedence of its Grand Lodge. Sweden constitutes a particular province, independent from the English. She has no other interest than that which promotes a close friendship and which is stated by the uniformity of the aims of its practices. So pretty sharp formulation in a kind of diplomatic instruction to Silverhjelm on how he should interact with people of the English Grand Lodge he is meeting. You can go to the next slide, please. And we have also a strange certificate that Georg Ulrich Silverhjelm received as a Swedish Masonic envoy to Britain in January 1798. Nobody has really been able to explain to me what this patent actually means, but there's something that Duke Charles tells Silverhjelm, produce this certificate if you have to. I have my theories about what this certificate is. I can share it with you if you're interested, but it's not super important for the chain of events. We can go further. Because what happened is, and furthermore, Silverhjelm was instructed by Duke Charles to regularly report to him about what is happening in England right now. Because certainly Freemason was under stress because of the political events. And what he did was that he provided him with this cipher instrument here. This is still preserved today in the archives of Swedish Order of Freemasons. And I don't know if you've played with those when you were a kid, but you're like turning them around. When the Boy Scouts, we did that in the Boy Scouts, and you can turn it around so you can use it. It's quite advanced, so it's not so simple that it's a substitution cipher, but you can. It's a kind of cipher machine, and you need instructions on how to turn this cipher grill, as it's called, in order then to decode what you have written in your letter. And these letters between Silverhjelm and Duke Charles are also preserved today. As you can see, this is dated in London, and the content is highly interesting. When I first found the correspondence in two archives, both of the Freemasons but also the Royal Library, I thought I will never be able to crack the code. But because how will I know how to turn this grill so that I can decipher? But then I was lucky, because Duke Charles, to whom this letter was sent, had made a transcript of it. So it was not me who cracked the code. I'm a very bad code cracker. But Duke Charles made transcriptions which make it which made it much easier to read. I've written about what they have written to each other in these correspondences, but it's an amazing thing. And at the time, several other of Duke Charles' friends and of his intimate circles are in different places in Europe. De la Gardie is one of them, and Duke Charles provided this cipher drill to all of them. In different patterns, but all of them had to communicate with him in this way, which is quite very fascinating. And there's also a host of correspondence that not is transcribed, that still awaits its to be cracked. Maybe with AI in the future. We don't know. Okay, we can go to the next slide. This is just a peculiar example. And this is the transcription. So you can see how happy I was when I found this transcription in the handwriting of Duke Charles. And then we can go further to the next one. So this is a transcribed and translated passage from the dispatch sent by Silverhjelm to Duke Charles. Freemasonry, which since my last day in England in a rather unimportant way was acknowledged by the public, has since that time in a high degree turned into a topic of diligent and curious public interest, and even more of closer investigation by the government. Two learned, the one a Scotsman, name of Robison, professor in Edinburgh, the other Frenchman called Barrel, an ex-Jesuit, have both within a year, and each in his own language, published writings accusing Freemasonry to be the breeding ground and nursery for the present teachings of revolution, destroying all societal order and legitimate government. With a certain but insufficient acquaintance of the true secret of Freemasonry, both have united a more true and extensive knowledge of Illuminatism, as it is written in the letter, both of its atheistic type from Bavaria, so the Bavarian Illuminati, the head of which was Weishaupt, as well of the mystical, which as its tools has used Cagliostro, Peter Gassner, and other publicly known charlatans. Now finally, it used two types of Illuminati as a vehicle to transport the systems, have gained access to the secrets of Freemasonry, and in particular for this purpose, have exploited its 3 craft degrees, has been known by these above-mentioned authors. But such a knowledge has then been applied by them without differentiation to throw a shadow on the entire order of Freemasonry, in particular its higher secrets. French Freemasonry, and particularly its operations under the rule of the Duke of Orleans, has been cited by Baruel as evidence for the activity of the entire order to bring about the present revolution of society. Although correct knowledge of the matter takes off all suspicion from the hazard posed to societies and religion by the Masonic order, if perceived as such in the right way, it is at the same time less surprising that the fear of the profane world has been awakened by these crippled but partly evidenced facts on the misuse that was caused by certain forms of Freemasonry. 18th century style, isn't it? You know, Baroque style. No dots, one sentence. Okay, let's go to the next slide. But I mean, but the importance of the letters between Silverhjelm and Duke Charles is that he informs him about the precarious state of English Freemasonry at the point. And it's a true proof of that. They are aware of these things. They are aware of the accusations, of the conspiracy theories, of the authors that are publishing about these things. And in that situation, Duke Charles instructs Silverhjelm back to say, I want you to contact the Prince of Wales, because I want to propose to him that we should form a closer union. That's quite amazing. And he is successful with that, because Silverhjelm then is admitted to a meeting at Grand Lodge in April 1799. The deputy Grand Master, I think the title was something else back in time, was the Scotsman called the Earl of Moira, which you have written about him quite extensively in your thesis. Very fascinating figure, absolutely super interesting person. He was instrumental in bringing in Silverhjelm into that Grand Lodge meeting, and where he was, well received and instructed to, and the Prince of Wales was instructed to write a letter back to Duke Charles, which I showed to you in the beginning, And in the important illustrations of Masonry of William Preston, it is said that from the above correspondence and the happy opening of the regular communication between the Grand Lords of England, Scotland, and Sweden, there's the greatest reason to believe that these best effects will result, and that agreeably to the wish of every zealous brother, a friendly and lasting intercourse will be preserved with the Freemasons of all the kingdoms. Now, as I said, on the surface this looks like any other kind of rapprochement between two Grand Lodges in the history of Masonry, but we need to study these things in the context of the societal development at the time. And that is why it's always so important to place these things in the kind of broader context. We can go to the next slide. So, in the aftermath of the Swedish rapprochement, the letter by Duke Charles was not only well received by the Modern Grand Lodge, which is documented, this was original records from Grand Lodge meeting, but it was used by Lord Moira in negotiating exemptions from the Unlawful Societies Act to Freemasonry of the 2nd of May 1799. So Lord Moira was called to Pitt, who led the government, and they were negotiating about exemption, because Freemasonry was very close of being prohibited in Britain at the time, which is kind of unimaginable because it was its country of origin. And according to the account that Silverhams gives to Duke Charles, his intervention makes that Moira can bring this letter of support from the Swedish Duke Charles and say, we are a respectable institution, the Swedes want to have communication with us. And then, of course, you don't forget the geopolitical aspects. In that moment, the alliance against Napoleon's forged between Sweden and England, for instance. But the delicacy surrounding the passing of the Unlawful Societies Act must also be understood in the tense relationship between the Prime Minister and George III and the Prince of Wales as a successor to the throne. And this is, again, British domestic politics. But that's also very interesting. And that there were rumors that Lord Moira potentially would become a prime minister if the Prince of Wales would become king. Now, this is, as I said, domestic politics in Britain, but they were intermingled with Freemasonry, as you can see. But to me, the interesting part here is that Silverham's dispatches provide with another piece in the puzzle as to why Prime Minister Pitt might have targeted Freemasonry, because it belonged to the camp of his political opponents. And then, of course, what you can see, what's happening in Britain at the time is that the domestic politics, the internal power play, uses the conspiratorial paranoia as a pretension for infringements of civil liberties. That is something you clearly can say is one of the elements of what we see is going on here. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. And then the longer-lasting influence of that rapprochement between Sweden and England was that over the next entire 2 decades, I would say, and perhaps ever since, there was a normalization taking place. And what then happened in 1813, when De la Gardie presided over the union of the ancients and the moderns, was some sort of pinnacle of demonstration of that new union in very, very tense political times. So, but if you go to Swedish Freemasonry, one can say that during the 1770s and 80s, Freemasonry was identified as a means to exercise influence in European affairs by soft politics. So Sweden was not any longer a great power, but the Swedish Duke Charles and also his brother Gustav III, before he was assassinated, clearly identified Freemasonry as a tool to make foreign elites interested in Sweden, so to speak. One of the ideas was, for instance, to establish or to extend the Swedish Order of Freemasons into the territory of the Russian Empire. I think that on this patent also Tallinn is mentioned. We have to look closer here, because what happened then was that Sweden wanted to extend its reach in organizational terms into the Russian Empire, including the other side of the Baltic Sea. But as I said, Sweden developed a stronger interest in Britain during the 1790s. There's this rapprochement that's part of that campaign. It's unintentionally or intentionally contributed to the extension of Freemasonry prohibition and the infringement of freedom of assembly. And if that is, can be substantiated more through more research, maybe more in these coded parts of the correspondence that we have not been able to decode yet, then that would be a proof of that sometimes Freemasonry and diplomacy definitely overlapping, and that it's very worthwhile to look twice at developments like these. Thank you. So, I want to finish up with some lessons for the future. We live in the age of generative AI, and I asked the generative AI called Copilot to create an image. Faced by the turmoil of the surrounding world, Freemasons need to stick together in the future. And that is what you get if you ask a generative AI model to produce that. It still looks very much like that. It is the Freemasons who are the evil guys. And what I want to show this to you is, do we today own the image of Freemasonry that is out there? Do we own the perception that a generative AI interprets Freemasonry to be? I'm not quite sure, I have to say. I like the Superman image up there to the left, and maybe the intellectual guy who's staring at the globe here, but the others clearly show that if you type in Freemasonry here, the perception is it's something sinister going on. And then the last slide, please. But still, I think, the lesson from that episode that I was talking to you about, there's a risk always when we do Masonic history that we're talking about dates and people, lodges and meetings and so on, and that we risk to see the larger picture. But if we go back to the end of the 1700s, the 1790s, we see that Freemasonry is a very serious crisis. It is accused of being used for revolution and for political ends. And in that situation, the Swedish Grand Lodge, certainly also inspired by geopolitical developments, decided we need to support what is going on there. There's this crisis going on in England. It's the birthplace of Freemasonry, and very unlikely, particularly if you look at the kind of instruction that Silverham got from Duke Charles about the supremacy of English Freemasons and so on. But this rapprochement happens in this context. And I think it's not an exception if you look into our times that we need to support each other. And another lesson is, of course, that Freemasonry can contribute to better relations between individuals as much as between cultures and nations. And harking back to what had been said before, that's a kind of ethos of 1723 and the constitutions. And then, of course, we need to continue to build bridges across obediences and discuss and address divisions as much as what unites us. Also, if you think that is a difficult task. And to the Grand Lodge of Estonia, I would like to say vivat, vivat, vivat. Thank you so much.